Hello and welcome to our second seminar in November. Today we have a distinguished panel of specialists on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Today we are covering a very important topic that is going to be affected by the recent shift in administration in the United States. As usual, we're going to give 8 minutes for each of our participants to do a round robin to make their opening comments and viewpoints on the topic at hand. And later on, we'll open the floor for any question and answers. For all participants, we welcome you, and we would invite you to post your questions online, either on Facebook or in any other platform that you are tuning in. I will first hand over the proceedings of this webinar to my colleague, Fadi Zatari, who is a senior research associate here at SIGA. As Fadi, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Weiss. Good evening to everyone. I'm happy to be in this panel and with these distinguished scholars. First of all, I would like to make some notes before we starting with our distinguished scholar. As a Palestinian, we don't see in America that there will be a kind of Palestine will be a priority in American foreign policy because America has a lot of things to do internally and externally with the COVID-19, of course, and the economic situation in America. Also, the next president need to fix the relationship that Trump destroyed with the American alliance in Europe and other places. Of course, for the Palestinian, if Trump would win, this would be the worst scenario. However, Biden, in the same times, he is a Zionist, and he declared this in different occasions that he is a Zionist. So there is not a lot of hope for the Palestinian in kind of administration to help them and to fix the relation with Israel. Of course, some steps can be taken, like reopening the BLO office in Washington, or sending back the aids for the Palestinian refugee on UNRWA, but that will need also a process, legal process in America, as I know. Of course, I would like to emphasize one important point, that the future of the Palestinian, as well as the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, depending also on the reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. This is a very important factor to determine the future of the Palestinian, as I said, and the American and the Israeli-Palestinian future relationship. That is to say that Palestinian on the ground can decide, and because if we are talking about deal of centuries or different agreements or the normalization with several Arab countries, that will not change a lot from the Palestinian side if the Palestinians are rejecting this kind of agreement. And that's why I believe deal of century is dead or about to be died. Not only because the Palestinian rejection to this agreement, but also the Trump administration is not there anymore to continue with this. Today we have 4 distinguished scholars. We would like to start with Mikko Beilet. Mr. Mikko Beilet is a writer and a human rights activist. We know a lot of his books, and especially the General Sun, a journey of Israeli in Palestine. And of course, he is most famously for supporting BDS, and we can see that he has BDS always with him. So we are happy to have you again. This is not just time to have you in SIGA. We have you physically 2 years ago, I think, right? And yeah. Now because of COVID, we have to have you somehow online. Unfortunately, we would like to have you all in SIGA in the future, inshallah. So yes, the floor is yours. And after that, we will proceed with the question.
Thank you, Fadi, for the introduction, and Dr. Sami for organizing and inviting me to participate. It's always a pleasure to be part of the SIGA events, and especially with such a great panel. It's a real honor, a real privilege. And of course, I look forward to the next opportunity to visit you in lovely Istanbul. I think as we look at this transition that's taking place here in the United States. Excuse me. I think we do have, I think, the possibility of some realistic expectations from the new administration. And then what we need to do is take advantage of whatever takes place and try to push forward, push the envelope as far as we can on the issue of Palestine. It's clear that a Biden administration is going to have a Zionist foreign policy, because Zionist foreign policy is the US foreign policy, particularly when we talk about, from Iran and all the way through the Middle East. And so a Zionist, this Zionist foreign policy is what American foreign policy is about. However, I think we can expect that there at least will be an attempt to bring for the US to come back, to return to the agreement with Iran. There may be an attempt by the US to return to fund UNRWA, albeit the funding was insufficient, was pathetic. And perhaps even reopening, like Fadi was mentioning, reopening the Palestinian mission in Washington, D.C. Now, if this is all the Biden administration does, it's not going to do a great deal of, it's not going to be a great help for the Palestinians. It'll be cosmetic, and it'll only bring things back to the way they were before Trump. However, it opens up the possibility, because there can be no doubt that the Zionist lobbies, the Zionist agents in the US are already pushing to make sure that these things don't happen. So for the Biden administration to return, to bring back those things, there will be friction with the Zionists, there will be friction with the state of Israel. And one would hope that they actually overcome the friction, that the Americans do stand up and actually go back to that point and actually act on these issues. Now, I think that there are some allies in Congress that voice at least some solidarity with the Palestinian issue, that voice some caring for BDS. And so I think what's important now is, if we do see these changes take place, and if we do see this door opening even slightly, that we push ahead as far as we can. I think unless or until we have a solid number of members of Congress who support BDS, or willing to come out clearly in support of BDS, because there's a small group, but of course it's not enough, then really we're not going to be able to accomplish much. But I think that is what needs to be our goal. I think we can certainly, if we work hard at it, we can probably get people like Betty McCollum, maybe even Bernie Sanders, and getting those names on board with BDS, on board with really understanding what justice for Palestine means, what a struggle for justice in Palestine requires. That should really be our goal. And again, if we can use that friction that's already going to, or we can expect will take place between the Biden administration and the state of Israel to our advantage, then I think we can see progress. But again, it's going to be incumbent on all of us to stand up and make sure that we open that door as wide as we can, and we push ourselves in, because that's how it works. There's no question. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody here what it's like when the Zionists hear that, any one of us comes to speak on a campus or comes to speak publicly they jump right at it. The Hasbara people, the Zionist student groups, they just jump on it with the anti-Semitism and so on. And I think that another thing that we would be wise of us to do is to make sure that at every point, at every possibility, we make it clear that this whole the weaponizing of anti-Semitism, the adopting of a new definition of anti-Semitism by the IHRA, is a false characterization of anti-Semitism. It's a false characterization of the Palestine solidarity movement. It's a false characterization of what justice in Palestine actually means. And really, again, knowing that where Biden is today, where it's clearly he's a Zionist, and clearly we can expect, if we do nothing, a purely Zionist foreign policy, I think what we should keep in mind is that the goal, at least in my opinion, is to get a large number, a serious number of members of the House of Representatives, members of Congress, to understand and support BDS, and eventually to come to the point where people understand that it's not about negotiations, that the issue of Palestine, the injustice in Palestine will not be resolved through negotiations with Israel. It has to be a post-Zionist reality. Only a post-Zionist reality can bring justice to Palestine. Negotiating with Israel, as we've seen anyway, because the Palestinians have tried for decades, is not only fruitless, but makes things progressively worse for the Palestinians on the ground. So if we keep that in mind as the goal, to bring as many people as possible, people in places of influence, to support BDS. Again, I'll say Betty McCollum and Bernie Sanders are already on board somewhat, to a certain degree, with the Palestinian issue. And then make people realize as much as possible that it's not about anti-Semitism, and the whole IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is meant only to protect Israel and to really handcuff and gag anybody who tries to support the Palestinian, the cause for justice in Palestine, and then to really push the envelope to the point where people realize and people understand that it's not about negotiating with Israel, it's about creating a real free democratic state in all of Palestine, which would have to be a post-Zionist Palestine. It's not going to be an Israel, it's going to be a free Palestine where we have one person, one vote. That should really be the goal. As long as Israel still carries some legitimacy, we're not going to be able to see any progress. So again, there's the realistic expectation. We should have our long-term goals. And I think, once again, because we can expect some friction, at least, between the Biden administration and certainly between Netanyahu, I'm sure there's no love lost there, because of Netanyahu's support for Trump. If we work hard and strategically, I think we can, in the next 4 years, we can make a big difference. We can create a big difference on the issue of bringing justice to Palestine. So I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Wise? Okay, Wise, are you there? Okay, thank you very much. Wise,
okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Miko, for your enlightening comments. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Ramzi Baroud. He is a professor of history, and he is known to all of you. We are looking forward to his comments. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramzi.
Thank you, brother. Just quick correction. I'm not a professor of history, nor do I aspire to be one, by the way, with all due respect to all professors. I first thank you very much for inviting me, SIGA, for continuing to kind of take one initiative after the other of organizing these kind of events and starting the conversation on many very important issues like this one, and also to Miko and the other speakers as well. I think it's important that we kind of keep something in mind. We are always, and I mean always, chasing after some American savior. In fact, sometimes even after Israeli saviors. I mean, those who have been following Israeli elections throughout the years, quite often Palestinians and Arabs kind of took positions with the hope that this particular politician is going to win over this other politician, and regardless of the outcome, it's always been the same. Whether it's Labour or Likud, whether it's Republican or Democrats, it really ends up being the same. And I'm not here trying to discourage anyone. I'm just examining historical evidence. We are yet to witness a single political precedent where we could claim with confidence that indeed, if the Democrats elect this person or that person, things could look up or change the unfortunate circumstances in Palestine. And I will tell you why this is not neither a defeatist nor a fatalistic view of politics, but rather a realistic one that requires real thinking, real positive thinking in some other opposing direction. Let's just examine the characters that Biden has already designated for the post, for the foreign policy posts. For example, Antony Blinken, who was just selected to replace Pompeo as a Secretary of State. His statements on Israel are well known. His allegiance to Israel is well known. He is no friend of the Palestinian people. He's been affiliated with Biden throughout various segments of his careers over the course of 20 years. And with all due respect, Biden's quite old. So this man has been kind of the right-hand man of Biden throughout the entire period in which he promoted Zionism and Israel first policies, chastised Palestinians, blamed Arabs, blamed Muslims, blamed Gaza for the siege, blamed Hamas for and so forth and so on. So, yes, Pompeo visited an illegal Jewish Israeli settlement and wined and dined with illegal settlers, true, but Blinken is going to bring superficial changes to the table. They always do. Just examine the situation under Obama. This is the man who spoke about the audacity of hope and change, came to Cairo a few months after he was elected president and start lecturing us, Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, on how to use peaceful methods of resistance and telling us we need to learn how to live with Israel. That was really the original normalization and so forth and so on. And after that heated and fiery speech and lecture, he turned around and he did exactly what Israel wanted him to do. He gave Israel more money than any other US president in history. And please, let's not dwell too much on that, too little, too late gesture of his few weeks before, during his lame duck presidency, just before he left, when he, kindly refused to veto a United Nations Security Council resolution pertaining to condemning Israel's Jewish settlements and so forth. That doesn't really count for much. And we know that actually that decision in a way kind of hurt us, because Trump came guns blazing, promising that he is going to change everything at the United Nations. So those anti-Semites who have been criticizing Israel throughout those years will be held at bay. And that's exactly what his ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has done and so forth. So we are playing the same game. We are hoping that Biden is slightly better. Well, maybe there are a few changes happening at a structural level within the Democratic Party. At the end of the day, I think what this is going to create is waste a lot of precious time. The Palestinian Authority is going to truncate itself back in that same position, talking about the two-state solution, talking about the painful compromises, returning to the unconditional negotiations and so forth and so on, while Israel continues to build illegal Jewish settlements, continues to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, carry on with the siege on Gaza. And trust me, I am telling you in advance, the US administration is going to stand there and support and defend every Israeli action. In other words, it's superficial. It's always been superficial. My real fear is not what Biden is going to do or not to do. My real fear is not whether he's going to give the money back to UNRWA or not. We are not beggars, and this is not about handouts. My real fear is that this is going to slow down the transition of unity among Palestinian groups. And this is really the most important element in all of this, because we always allow Washington and Tel Aviv to play these kind of political games with us, to divide us with the hope that someone is going to get the carrot as opposed to the stick. And at the end of the day, it ends up being the same situation. Don't put any expectations on Biden. Biden is not a Zionist in the way that we use the word Zionist, as in he's a really bad guy, he's pro-Israel, he's a Zionist. It's not a swear word. Biden is a Zionist ideologically so. He has said it repeatedly. I have traced his quotes all the way since 1984, and he has always been making the argument that you don't need to be Jewish to be a Zionist. He's a Zionist, and he's proud of it, and that is not going to change. The onus is not on Biden and his administration. The onus is on us as Palestinians, as Arabs, as Muslims, as our supporters all over the world. How are we going to change tactics so we don't fall in the same trap and play the same old game all over again? And this is it for me for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramzi, for your talk. This is very interesting. I think you are very realistic with analyzing this situation. Now we will move to our third speaker, Professor Rabab Abdelhadi. She is a professor of sociology at San Francisco State University. She has many publications on Palestine and the resistance and justice, freedom in Palestine, etc. And she also very prominent speaker in the in America about the Palestinian right and freedom. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good evening. I wanted to first acknowledge that San Francisco State University sits on stolen indigenous peoples Ohlone land. And I'm saying that because this week, some people in the US are celebrating what it's called Thanksgiving, and we call it Thanks-taking, with the myth that's very similar to what's going on in Palestine as well. The Zionist myth and the US settler colonial myth is very similar. Secondly, I want to think about the fallen. When we come here today, last week was the birthday of Sheikh Azzeddin al-Qassam, November 20th. And now one of the issues that we are actually confronting is the US demand on the Palestinian Authority to drop its historical commitment to people who've sacrificed their lives, to martyrs, to prisoners, and so on. And I think this is an issue we really need to talk about because it's also coming from the Biden campaign, and as well as people who have fallen all over, including in the United States here, both in the struggle against settler colonialism, as well as the struggle against racism and all forms of discrimination, including around Palestine, Arab and Muslim issues. Third, I want to renew my opposition and criticism of having this on the Zoom platform, that Zoom has silenced us. So I have to keep saying that until we actually get and find alternative open source platform and not rely on multinational corporations that actually use their own private resources in alliance with Zionist groups to shut us down, to actually veto our open classroom 2 months ago and have determination over our academic freedom. This is really important and is very much connected with the struggle around Palestine, the question around BDS, the question about freedom of speech. And that's where I would kind of like speak a little bit about that, is that what do we think about Biden? I definitely agree with what Miko has been saying and what Ramzi, my colleagues have been saying, is that the US administration, Biden administration, is going to pursue ideologically, politically, strategically, economically, militarily, the policies of the US administrations historically, because just because one administration changes does not change the nature of this regime, of the United States regime. There are certain things that change here and there. And another thing to think about is that with the US itself, even if we want to talk about the administrations themselves, we have not yet, around the question of Palestine, around questions that concern all of us, have not been able to shift things the way that around the Vietnam, things have shifted. People who were in Washington actually were divided around the question of Vietnam, which along with the struggle of the Vietnamese people and the US peace movement, as well as an international movement, basically was able to bring the Vietnamese to victory in 1975. where they actually discussed even the details as the shape of the table. And I'm saying this is why this to actually symbolically also think about that in terms of how the Palestinian Authority is actually relating to the US, to compare the two and contrast them. But there are some changes that we are seeing. Part of it is because Trump historically has actually deviated from the neoliberal agenda of the United States. I mean, Trump has completely destroyed the neoliberal agenda and moved towards what we can say resemble fascism. And I think that's really important to us, for us to think about that in terms of who are the powers that ally with him and who are the people who are against him. So I think that's in terms of political development and so on, it's really important to take into consideration. But then come Biden-Harris. And Biden-Harris, even when he was actually in the Democratic Party, leaving Democratic Party, Biden is always sort of as a Washington insider. And all the discussions are everybody is going to bring into the administration is a Washington insider. And that really worries me, because once you say Washington insider, I'm not saying that he could have there was pressure on him, but Washington insider means that the people who are actually in Washington, who most likely are lobbying the constituencies on behalf of big interests in Washington rather than the other way around. I mean, this is the whole principle about representation, Congress, Senate, politics, and so on, is you're supposed to actually represent the interests of the people who elected you in the higher offices and so on. And this is quote unquote the principles of liberal democracy, which everybody around the world is always criticized by the US government over, but the US government actually does not necessarily always implement it. So there were a very big debate between within the Democratic Party, between groups like such Justice Democrats, groups like Sunshine Movement, and others. And these Justice Democrats, to them belong a big group of people who support justice in for Palestine. And I'm not saying Palestinian in particular, I'm saying justice because I want to separate the whole question of nationness and nationality from the issues themselves. And so the Justice Democrats, for example, suggested Barbara Lee, the congresswoman, the black congresswoman from California, who was the only one who voted against the invasion of Iraq, to be Secretary of State. Of course, he chose Blinken. Surprise, surprise. Why are we? And then there is like all discussions about who's going to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Is it going to be Elizabeth Warren, or is it going to be somebody that he will pick from Wall Street? And he's been actually talking with Wall Street around the question of how to deal with the COVID-19. There is issues around the pressure to kind of bring Bernie Sanders. And then the centrist in the Democratic Party, Biden would be actually like right of center, let's say, within the Democratic Party itself, in terms of the balance of forces. There were discussions about Bernie Sanders, or what the Palestinians called Ammo Bernie, and which is actually also defies the whole question of actually saying that Palestinians are historically anti-Jewish, because this is here is a Jewish man who always identified, and people supported him because of the issues, and I think this is really important. And so the discussion coming back from the Democratic Party, from the centrists and the conventional leadership of the Democratic Party, is that no, you can't have Sanders, you can't have Elizabeth Warren, because if you remove them, who are you going to put in the Senate in their places? Because the Senate is very tough and so on. So every single time an issue comes up to advocate in any kind of appointment, any kind of move, there is an answer for it from Biden, including in his campaign. And I want to connect a couple of issues that I think are really, really important. Maybe mention one thing about the Palestinians and move on, and then we can have a discussion. One is that there is I believe that what happened in these elections, in the last election, got sharpened more. Not what was happening Biden and Harris came up with a platform for Arab Americans. The platform talks about the DC office, talks about UNRWA, talks about opening a consulate in Jerusalem, which is kind of like reversing, talks about no additional annexation, talks about freedom of speech, even though he says he's against BDS, but supporting freedom of speech. There is multiple things that are maybe specifically of concern to people who study and talk about and advocate specifically on Palestine, but they are of concern to anybody who cares about questions of justice for all. And this is why I think it's really, really important if we shift our discussion from thinking Palestine, which is the Zionist agenda on Palestine, as a foreign policy issue for the US, and Palestine as being an issue, special interest group that only concerns Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, and maybe it's a kind of handful of Jews and so on, which is also not true, but actually an issue of justice, then Palestine becomes seen, we can evaluate Palestine within the Democratic Party and within US politics, vis-a-vis what happens with other issues. So has Biden stopped funding the police? No, he said he wasn't going to do it. After the murder of George Floyd, after the killing of many people and the black uprisings that have been going. Has Biden said that he is going to really support healthcare? No, he hasn't. Even his policy is even lower than Obamacare, okay, which wasn't really sufficient. Has Biden also done anything around the whole question of the $38 billion that Obama did, right? And he was his vice president right before he stepped out of office in 2016? No. So there are certain issues that are very given, and this is what I'm agreeing with Miko and Ramsey, that there are givens in US policy. But I think one of the issues, and by the way, there are members of Congress who supported BDS, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Cory Bush, and you coming to Alexander Cortez refused to participate even in the Rabin with the American Friends for Peace Now and so on. So there are some shifts, and there are some shifts that have happened when the Senate discussed BDS. It's not enough. There are some cracks, and I think they are. But I think I want to also take it back that this is part of US policy. This is historically part of US policy. If we see more changes around the question of anti-Black racism, if we see more changes against fracking and support for indigenous rights, if we see more changes around the whole xenophobia and the anti-Asian violence, if we see changes around the borders and caging children and families, if we see changes about climate, about fair distribution and so on, we're going to see more changes around Palestine. I think Palestine being seen by itself is not going to work by itself, but I do see these changes with these alliances, and I think that's the best hope. Maybe not in this administration. And also, let's also remember that before they're getting out of power, Pompeo and Trump are actually trying to create more facts on the ground. So it would appear from the pro-Israeli point of view, from the Zionist point of view, as if Biden is doing us favors by, he's restoring back what they made in the West Bank labels on the goods that are coming from the colonies, okay? And so it's cosmetic change that should not be enough. And so we're depending on people who are actually closer to them, but we're depending on a larger movement. I think the last part of the equation is what the Palestinian Authority is going to do. So now we hear the Palestinian Authority was boycotting the Trump administration for good reasons. Finally, and then they said they're going to dismantle the Oslo Accord. The Oslo Accord was dead and so on. Now we see, even before Biden got into power, the the Trump administration gave multiple gifts to Israel and basically kind of like enabled Netanyahu to continue getting elected despite the multiple corruption scandals and so on. I'm not even talking within the politics of Israel. I mean, even if you leave the Palestinians out of it. But now the Palestinian Authority, even before the guy got into office, and after people who pressured him to have the Arab American agenda, after people have pressured on multiple things, after Palestinians within the Democratic Party and their allies, multiple people, not just Betty McCollum, a whole bunch of people, 350 delegates to the Democratic National Convention, passed a resolution to actually demand that he drops the Zionists in the administration, that he support Palestinian rights and so on. The Palestinian Authority comes before anything happens, lifts the boycott, as if there is something, as if the United States has done anything. When Pompeo was there last week only, I mean, he's part of the US government, the State Department, still the State Department of the US government until January 20th. It hasn't changed to Biden. They actually, they renewed the security collaboration with Israel. They're dropping the martyrs and the prisoners from being actually honored by the Palestinian and recognized for the sacrifices they made, and trying to turn it into social welfare issue, the funding for the donor. And they are basically trying, and then the reason they're saying is that because there are some Washington insiders are having Zoom calls with members of the Palestinian Authority and telling them, you better do this, because if you don't do this, Biden is not going to do this. But Biden already gave a platform. I mean, that the platform is actually should be only the beginning, the point of departure, not the end point. If the reversal of some of the things that Trump has done is not enough, we already know even before Trump came into power, things were really terrible. So the question is, this is, I think, one of the bigger tasks that we have to have a discussion about is what does it mean? Who's representing the Palestinians? Who's speaking in the name of the Palestinians? How are people going to equally challenge Trump, Biden's and Harris support for Israel and Zionist agenda, as well as the other injustices that I've talked about, as well as challenging the Palestinian Authority that seems to be handing them things on a silver platter, like, here, please take it. Why would Palestinians then, why would Trump, why would Biden even be motivated? Why would he have an incentive to do anything if the people who are supposed to represent, and I keep saying supposed to represent the Palestinians, are already saying it's okay, take whatever you want, and so on, which is the same stuff again and again and again. And I think these are part of the discussions that we need to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rabab. Our next speaker is Dr. Samuel Arian. He is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, and a longtime activist and stakeholder in the struggle for Palestine. Dr. Sami.
Thank you very much, Rawais and Fadi, for moderating this important session. And thank you for my co-panelists and colleagues, Miko, Rabab, and Ramzi, for being here. In the few minutes I have, I would like just to go over the positions of the major players in this conflict, just to assess the situation. First, on the part of the Israelis, since at least the mid-90s, when the Palestinian leadership at the time, not the Palestinian people, recognized Israel and recognized Israel in 78% of historical Palestine, Israel had a choice to make, but they had to choose 2 out of 3 things. They had to choose either to be democratic with the pre-1967 areas, which would make them a democracy and within the context of the 2-state solution, or they could choose to have the whole land and the people and forget about being a Jewish and keep democracy, in which it would be the so-called 1-state solution, or they would try to keep the land and keep being Zionist and Jewish and disenfranchise the Palestinians and have an apartheid regime, an apartheid-like regime. It's beyond anybody's argument that what the Israelis have chosen, particularly during the Netanyahu and the right-wing successive Israeli governments, is that they have chosen the latter. And what we have today is just the consolidation of this choice. And everybody knows this, except maybe the Palestinians sitting in Ramallah, that the 2-state solution has died, and the 1-state solution is never going to be a reality with the current balance of power. The Americans have recognized this for a long time. We could see it at least since the Obama administration, when Kerry himself, who was Secretary of State, gave a speech towards the end of his tenure in which he recognized this reality. What Trump did was trying to jump all the issues related to any kind of rights to the Palestinians, adopted all the right-wing positions of the Israeli politicians, and tried to integrate Israel in the overall composition of the Middle East, of the Arab world, hoping that somehow this Palestinian issue would go away. On the Palestinian, so Israel has chosen, and it's not realistic to think that there will be a revival of the 2-state solution, particularly that there is no one in Israel actually believes in it or actually advocating it, including those who are on the left, if there is any if there is any left in Israel. On the issue of the Palestinians, what we have today also is an absolute disaster situation. The PLO is no longer a reality, is no longer a body that can actually speak on behalf of the Palestinians. It doesn't exist anymore. Israel was successful in transforming an organization that claimed to be the only representative of the Palestinian people, to be on basically life support, and that it replaced it with an authority that is simply what is making it more secure in its occupation. It replaced occupation with Palestinian administration that is trying to control and tame the Palestinians or any kind of resistance. And we've seen this over and over and over again, particularly during Abbas's era. And last week was just a demonstration of this when they regained the so-called security coordination, because one administrative general who is in charge of the West Bank wrote someone else that they are willing to give them back the money which they collected on behalf of them, Palestinian money, minus the money that is supposed to go to the families of the victims of martyrs and prisoners. So on the Palestinian side, unfortunately, we do not have someone who believes in their own cause. The Palestinian Authority has transformed itself into an elite people who have many privileges and who have lost their way to represent their own people. And all what they get is privileges and for the services they give to the occupation. And there is not much to be expected, even though some people had hopes, but these hopes were pretty much dashed. And I don't think they were ever reasonable hopes, because the approach that one side of this Palestinian faction has chosen, they are never going to change because of the amount of interests, personal interests that they have at stake here. So I don't expect any kind of reconciliation to take place. And this has been obviously affirmed last week when they resumed the security coordination, which killed any kind of Palestinian reconciliation. And what we have today, even within the Fatah, the ruling faction in the in Ramallah, in the West Bank, particularly in the Palestinian town, because they don't really rule the West Bank, is you have even factions within factions. Abbas is not going to go back to any kind of strategic choice of confronting, or at least going back to a situation where he will not recognize Oslo and its aftermath. And what you have is different people who are contending that who's going to replace him, with no one really has the upper hand or the authority. On the American situation, when you assess the American situation, you will find that, as my colleagues have said before me, is that there isn't a genuine change. Biden has a lot on his plate, a lot of domestic problems that he has to deal with. COVID is just the least of it. When you talk about economy and we talk about trade and you talk all kinds of social problems, racism and so on and so forth, add to this the pandemic, he has a lot on his plate. And then internationally, he has to focus on China, the rise of China, and to rejoin most of the treaties that Trump withdrew from. But importantly, of course, as far as the Middle East is concerned, to repair his situation with Iran, particularly that they cannot ignore the fact that Iran could be close to producing nuclear fissile material, not necessarily a material bomb. So he has to do. So when it comes to Palestine, we don't really have an Israeli person or Israeli partner interested in a kind of two-state solution, and they know that it's dead. All what he's trying to do is cosmetic change in order to manage the conflict rather than to resolve the conflict, which has been the case since '93. On the global scene, you look at Europe, totally incompetent. They can't do anything of substance, even when it's in their own interest. We've seen that in the nuclear deal with Iran. Certainly, they will take a back seat. They will never push Israelis or do any of the sort. On the regional, and of course, Russia and China are not much better. They're going to give you rhetoric, nothing else. On the regional scene, you will find that we really have two camps. One camp is totally allied with Israel now, and those are the ones who have chosen this path openly now after the 2011 uprisings and the changes, the revolutions that were taking place, where people were demanding their own independence and or democratic path and self-determination. And they have openly now been asking and signed normalization treaties with Israel, and these people would never be. If there was ever a 1% chance of a two-state solution, they killed it, because there is absolutely no incentive for Israel to sign anything or to give up anything. And on the other hand, you have other regional powers who are pro-Palestinian, but they have their own problems, both domestically and also the American administration, when we talk about Turkey and Iran as examples. So we're back to the situation where the situation is very bleak. However, in the minute that I have left, there has to be a change, and that change that none of these forces have been giving any kind of a concern to, which is the popular movements. What Miko was talking about, what Ramzi was talking about, what Rabab was talking about, is that what we need is a global solidarity movement, a movement for justice for Palestine. I have identified in different forums that and I think Miko alluded to this, that our goal is not a one-state or two-state solution. Our goal is to dismantle a Zionist state that is based on discrimination and apartheid-like conditions. And if that is the case, then we need to understand what are the imperatives that keep this state going. What are the sources for its strength and for its survival? As I said in a different forum, I have identified 12 different imperatives. And I think what we need is a global movement that is going to go not just with Palestinians. This is global, meaning that all kinds of people will be part of it. Parties, peoples, movements, even governments. Because when you look at these imperatives, that the Palestinians cannot do them or undo them by themselves, and some of them cannot be done by individual people. You need some states, you need some major powers taking place into this. So once we build this movement, I believe that we could be on our road. Now, everything else that takes place, any changes, any opportunities that take place, they can aid in bringing about this outcome, in reaching our goal. And I'm not pessimistic, but of course I have to be optimistic, and we have to work towards this goal. It would take a lot of efforts and a lot of sacrifices, but eventually I believe that time is on our side, despite what people say. And I see that the movement, this global movement, is growing, not receding. We've seen, and some of the speakers today talked about some of the Congress people. I remember 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have a single person who would talk about Palestinian rights. Today, you have a few. But I think overall, this movement, once it strengthens and gains steam, they will have real difference, not only on US campuses, but throughout US cities and throughout the world as well. And I think in terms of the Palestinians themselves, what they need to do is to make sure they stay on their own land, that don't leave, because that's what is required of them. Because the Zionist dream would not be fulfilled unless and until Palestinians are totally exiled and leave their homes. As long as they stay there, I think the conflict and this struggle will go on, and I think eventually we will gain freedom for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. And now we will open the first round of question. I will give every one of you 3 to 4 minutes to answer. I would like to start with Miko Bailey. I believe BDS is a very important element in this struggle for justice in Palestine. And we learn a lot from South Africa, the experience in South Africa and the boycott there in South Africa. So I would like to hear from you, how can we activate the BDS more in the future in America? Dr. Ramzi, you talk about we are asked, or the Palestinians are asked, to always to show some good intention, and meanwhile the settlement is continuing and the Palestinians are losing the land in Palestine, and this is very, very important things. So how can the Palestinians change this narrative from being always they need to show a good intention toward the Israeli or toward the Jewish people, etc. Dr. Rabab, you talk about how can we make this struggle an issue for justice, which I agree with you, because I think doing this case, the Palestinian issue as an issue for justice, this is very important because it's not limited for the Palestinian, and this was said by Dr. Sami, of course, and it's not limited to Arab or Muslim. it's an issue for humanity, it's an issue for justice and dignity. And yeah, so my question is, how can we make a new alliance, as you said, in this regard, and how can we improve ourselves in this issue, making Palestinian issue as an issue of justice, more rather than being like a Islamic issue or an Arab issue. Also, I would like to ask Dr. Sam, I have a lot of a question for you, but one of them I would like to start with, and the next I can continue in the next time. Who is representing the Palestinian? Because we have really this dilemma always, seeing like people who don't represent the Palestinian, speaking in the name of the Palestinian. And how can we define the new way of who presenting the Palestinian? Because even we saw in the last days how the Palestinian Authority came back to negotiation with Israel and showing like doing this again, the security coordination through just telephone call. However, with the Palestinian, between Fatah and Hamas, this is since almost years now, and we don't have like the advancement in this regard. So please, everyone, like 2 to 3 minutes, and then we will continue the question.
Do you want me to start? Is that how we're doing
yes,
it?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think one of the problems of the conversation, the discourse on Palestine, is that it follows where the Zionists are taking us. In other words, they point and people go. They point this way and people go. So people talk about Fatah, Hamas. They talk about terrorism. We talk about terrorism. We talk about anti-Semitism. We talk about anti-Semitism. And what BDS does, it allows us to broaden the conversation, because the demands of BDS touch on the three, what I believe are the three central issues that make up the issue of Palestine, the injustice in Palestine, the military occupation in parts of Palestine where that still exists, the apartheid regime, because we know that there's no place in Palestine, in historic Palestine, not in the Nakab, not in Jerusalem, not in Jaffa, not in Haifa, not in Jalil, nowhere, where there's any kind of equality between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, even among what they call the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And what is, I believe, and I'm sure we all agree, is an incredibly important and central issue to this, to the Palestinian cause, the right of return. And I'll plug in the book that just came out recently, The Palestinian Refugees in International Law, which really expands the conversation on that issue. Well, these three issues are part of the demands of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So I always say the BDS call, and emphasizes that the Palestinian call for BDS is really is a gift. It presents us with incredible opportunities and the possibility to broaden the conversation. The problem is not only Gaza and what remains of the West Bank, like Dr. Sami was saying, the small parts where Palestinians still reside and where the PA, has some control. Palestine is from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, from the border with Lebanon until the Gulf of Aqaba. This is all of Palestine. Palestinians reside in all of those places, and Palestinians have issues that need to be resolved. And the cause of the problems is the existence of this Zionist apartheid regime that has been imposed. Now, it's very convenient for the conversation to leave out the refugee issue. But we cannot talk about Palestine or any kind of resolution of the question of Palestine without the refugee issue. And so again, the demands of the call for BDS bring all these issues back to the table, force us to see the entire picture, and they deal with how these are the three remedies. This is how the demands are remedial. In order to bring justice to Palestine, if you will, to the issue of Palestine, we need to end the military regime. we need to end the apartheid regime, and we need to drop the ban on refugees to return to their lands and their home, and then of course reparations and compensation for their losses. So the conversation on that, I think, is crucial. Now, of course, the Zionists have pushed, anti-Semitism and all these other things in order to obscure the conversation and shift it and throw all these smoke screens. But I think it's imperative that we remain completely focused and not get distracted by all these things that the Zionists throw at us. Has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. You can't really in good conscience be part of a call to bring justice to Palestine and be anti-Semitic and be racist. In other words, it's an absurd proposition that somehow the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel is somehow anti-Semitic. And one of the points in the IHRA this new definition of anti-Semitism, is that claiming or calling the state of Israel a racist endeavor and stating that Zionism is a racist ideology, is somehow discriminates against the Jews, the rights of Jews to self-determination. But it's important to make clear that the state of Israel is not an expression of Jewish self-determination. It's an expression of Israeli and Zionist self-determination. It has nothing to do with Jews. And pointing out that it is an illegitimate racist regime, an illegitimate racist ideology, is, I think, part of the conversation that we need to have. And when we get to that point, I believe we'll have made progress. So again, opening up the conversation and using BDS as a tool is incredibly important. And of course, the actual boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a tool. I think some of you, I'm sure many of you have been to South Africa. When you talk to South Africans, they, almost everybody says BDS, without BDS, we would not have been able to dismantle apartheid in this country. And I think the same, we'll be saying the same thing about Palestine when Palestine is free. And I share Dr. Sami's optimism. I think these things actually move quite faster. And if I'll just say one more thing, Dr. Rabab talked about Vietnam. There used to be a state called South Vietnam, and the United States swore that they will never forsake their most important ally in Southeast Asia, South Vietnam. And like I said, in the mid-1970s, it was over, and today there's no such place. So I think that's it. All of these things are important to remember. And again, I think BDS is a central part of the Palestinian resistance, and I think it should be a central part of the conversation because it brings everything, all the different elements, into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramzi.
Thank you, Fadi, and thank you, Miko, for your comments. And earlier, Professors Abdul Hadi and Professor Aryan. Just want to say that there is some history to this idea of Palestinians having to show good intentions. I mean, it really goes back to the 70s if you want to look at it from a historical point of view. But I would say, like, officially, not until 1988, when the US decided to so-called engage the PLO in Tunis, in Tunisia, like this idea of Palestinians have to prove, have to put something on the table, have to make concessions, have to, demonstrate their peaceful intents and intentions to Israel and to the United States in order for them to be engaged. Sadly, the PLO played that game, and they are continuing to play it until today in the character of the Palestinian Authority. And I don't want to branch off, but really, when you think about it, we quite often just blame the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas in particular for the mess our leadership is in. But if you look at it from a historical point of view, this has been going on for several decades now, and it's a trajectory, and it just keeps evolving into that direction, that we have to prove that we are worthy of being peace partners, so-called, for Netanyahu and the US. It started when the Palestinians were being asked, you can't engage, or we cannot engage with you until you renounce violence. Yasser Arafat will go and would renounce violence in a fiery speech and so forth. And then the Americans would say, no, you renounce it in English. You have to renounce it in Arabic so that your people may hear it. And he would go and do the same thing. And You have to accept UN Resolution 242 and 338 regarding the division of Palestine and the occupied territories, and Arafat would do the same thing, even though Israel never really accepted these resolutions, and they still don't accept them until today. Now, these kind of political concessions that the PLO has made throughout the years are now part of our political culture. And I don't just blame the White House and the Americans or the Israelis for it. It's happening within our own movement. I mean, who of us who's been traveling and speaking about Palestine hasn't been confronted by the Palestine solidarity people, or people who think or perceive themselves to be pro-Palestine, of why are you, supporting violent acts in Palestine? Armed resistance should be completely out of the way. Those Hamas people are really bad news. We don't like them, and so forth. So we are constantly trying to prove, even to our friends, that we are good people, that we do not want to destroy Israel, that we're not anti-Semitic, that we do not embrace violence, that we didn't all elect Hamas, and so forth and so on. So this idea is rooted in history, and it's never in the history of liberation movements around the world. Vietnam is mentioned, and maybe I disagree with some elements in the use of Vietnam in that context. South Vietnam is certainly nothing like Israel, but the Vietnamese were never accepted on themselves to be used in that way. Yes, they were demanding concessions from the communist resistance in Vietnam, but the Vietnamese would never even give them the light of day. We did. We played this game so very well. And this is why we constantly find ourselves in this situation. I'll give you an example. After Blinken was nominated by Biden to become the next Secretary of State, Rashida Tlaib made a seemingly honest tweet in which she said, in reply to the advisor of Bernie Sanders, who said, this is a solid choice. It's not a solid choice, by the way, but this is what the Sanders campaign are saying. And Rashida Tlaib replied by saying, well, as long as I am not being denied, my First Amendment tried to be critical of Israel. And guess what is the Zionist response in this country? That is now being promoted by Fox News and other mainstream media, calling Rashida Tlaib anti-Semitic. What do you expect Rashida Tlaib is gonna do? She's gonna find herself in a situation where she's gonna say, I'm not anti-Semitic, and she is going to go on the defensive. We all do. I'm not blaming her for what she is yet to say, but we all do. We all find ourselves trying to prove that we are not as bad as they say we are. So we are constantly being put on the defensive because of this kind of thinking. It's very dangerous, and it's not going to lead us anywhere. The proper way of doing things is for Palestine to be reclaimed by the Palestinian people, by Palestinian voices, by Palestinian priorities, where Palestinians are the one who puts the demands. We shouldn't be looking at Biden saying, can you please do this or do that? We need to be listing a set of demands. And if these demands are not met, that we do not engage with the Americans. We don't talk to the White House, because we have enough experience to tell us that engaging unconditionally will never allow, will never yield to anything and will never take us anywhere. We have an incredible culture, a thriving, living culture. We have a strong people. How many people, how many nations could survive what the people in Gaza are surviving right now? I am not celebrating victimization. I am just saying that we have such stamina, such collective will and stamina. We have strong people who can withstand any kind of pressure. Now we need to harness the energies of these people in order for us to present ourselves as a unified front and put demands on the Americans and on everybody else, as opposed to be these trained circus monkeys, as we have frankly been for many years, trying to dance on every tune, whether the EU, whether the Americans, whether this and that. And at the same time, we never get anything in return. The settlements are being expanded. Palestinians are losing at every front, and so forth. We need radical change as opposed to just going back to the same old game.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramzi. Dr. Rabat.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think one of the things, in order for us to be able to actually frame Palestine in the sense of justice. So the justice in for Palestine really becomes seen as part of the indivisibility of justice. I think we need to, I do agree with Ramzi about centering the voices of Palestine, but I want to also kind of like say, who are we? I mean, are we all the same? And obviously we're not all the same. So I think I want to kind of like center definitely the question of Palestinian liberation and resistance, and stay away. And I will add one more thing about the whole staying away from the internalized colonialism. And Ramzi spoke about Vietnam, but let's also take the example of Algeria. Let's take the writings of Palestinians and non-Palestinians. I mean, it's not just Frantz Fanon who talked about it. We know that to be like one of the most important foundational texts, but actually foundational is I'll put it in as a scholar in parentheses, because there are a lot of also examples in our histories and so on. And part of the colonial project is actually to, let's just say, speak Palestinian English. So I will just leave it at that. We can talk about that some other time and so on, but this is part of it. And what does it mean then if we want to actually center the Palestinian project of freedom and resistance, which also speaks to what Miko speak about in terms of BDS? I think it's really a very big mistake to continue saying Palestinian-Israeli conflict or Arab-Israeli conflict or conflict. I think referencing it as a conflict is very problematic, because conflict, when you do that, you go into international relations, you go into political science. I'm talking now about scholarship. You go into what do you call it, conflict resolution. This becomes a very big, it's a huge industry. And it looks at, okay, there is like this fight between these two parties. They're symmetrical. I mean, this is the implication. We argue that it's not, but they're symmetrical. We need to actually bring them together. And then you need to find somebody, the US, who's the broker, who will bring them together, sit in a room and say, which is the US done a lot of the time, which is also colonial discourse. Let them talk, because they will talk each other to death until they get it. And that's really very problematic, because it elates the whole issue that this is a question about colonialism, this is a question about oppression, this is a question of displacement, of erasure of a whole people, and so on. If we kind of stop talking about that and talk about this as a question, eventually as a question of justice, but initially as a question of colonization, as a question of displacement. I mean, kind of like I'm not talking about BDS because Mika spoke about that, but it's like the three parts of the BDS demands and so on. Talk about what does this mean? Place the voices, uplift the voices, highlight the voices. So I think that's really, really important to do that. Like place Palestinians at the center of analysis. Place the people who are oppressed at the center, but not only as victims, also as people who are fighting, speaking up for themselves, because a lot of the times people speak for it. This also requires that we don't exceptionalize Palestine. We don't think of Palestine as, as a lot of Palestinians said, we are very unique. We're the only occupation. We're the last occupation. Ala ras narisha, if you want to say bil Arabic. No, there isn't, okay? There are specificities, definitely, to the Zionist project. There are specificities to Palestine. There are specificities to the region. But do these specificities rise up to actually make Palestine the only issue in the world, that we're always alone? That's what people always say, which is really not true, because Palestine actually has tons of solidarity from many more than many other, also as worthy causes. So I think if we don't exceptionalize Palestine and think of Palestine as a question of justice and injustice, and stay away from these kind of like very colonialist term, and also the whole question of the conflict actually also brings a problem, because then it says, oh, this is land for peace. Palestinians need land, but Israel needs peace. As if Palestinians don't need peace, as if Palestinians don't need security, as if Palestinians' security as a people, not only as individuals, as communities, as different places, and so on, is not at stake. The very presence of the whole people is a question of security. So even those things, we need to stay away from them. I would actually shift a little bit the whole question about anti-Semitism and Zionism, and I think it's really important to speak about it. I agree with the way Ramzi is saying that it should not be a way for us to pay homage because somebody is asking us. This is part and parcel of the Palestinian project. Historically, the Palestinian resistance was against settler colonialism. The Palestinian resistance was never against the Jews. I mean, this is kind of like even the whole question of Zionism, which I always say it's a passing phenomena. Zionism was only one colonial answer to how to fight anti-Semitism. And I think it's really important. And this historically has been the Palestinian project, historically. And I think by allowing us to kind of say, we're terrorists, we're not terrorists, and so on, we are speaking on their own terms. I agree with that. I think when we do that, then the question is then when we frame Palestine, which we've done this in the project, Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice, that's a scholarly project, but also in the struggle of Palestine historically, this has been defined before Palestinians started catering to petrodollars and international public opinion and so on, and basically remaking themselves into something I'm not saying the Palestinian leadership, by the way. Everybody else wants them to be, not what they want to be. Because if we look at statistics and look at polls and so on, Palestinians today continue actually supporting self-determination, continue supporting end of the Zionism as a settler colonial project, continue supporting dignity. I mean, this is kind of like when the Arab revolutions began, they were talking about bread and dignity. And dignity sometimes gets displaced because it's told about, oh, it's just a fluffy concept we need to think about. And this brings me to my last point, is the question of how do we then frame that in alliances with other people? So if we're talking about the United States, for example, is it really, and I began by saying about that, is it really appropriate for Palestinians who day in and day out, and Palestinian supporters who are struggling against settler colonialism to kind of like say, oh, we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving? What is that? I mean, kind of like people read, it's history, Google it if you don't want, it's there. It's a myth, and it's a myth exactly about the ways Israel kind of like says that, oh, everybody, all the Palestinians are very happy Palestinians, Israel have democratic rights and so on. It is not helpful in political analysis to say, oh, the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, just like the US Declaration of Independence, because that's a settler. I mean, yeah, if you say about Israeli quote unquote Declaration of Independence, it's like the US, makes sense because the settlers kind of actually separating themselves from colonists. But I think it's really, really important for us to think about that. I think it's really important to identify with the people who are rising up, who are not exactly the same. The martyrdom of George Floyd is not exactly the same as the martyrdom of Palestinians, but there are a lot of similarities that also lead us to the collaboration between the US and securitized industries and the consideration of who is a terrorist. And the United States, by the way, the FBI created the counterterrorism task force about the movement for Black lives. Many of the people don't even know that. I think it's really, really important. And there are a lot of people who are actually rising up and sacrificing and losing historically in the Black community, in multiple communities. And I would say also not only South Africa, but let's think about the Black Power movement, the civil rights movement, SNCC, the lunch counters, boycott, and so on. There is a lot of examples of that actually also support this case. So if we think about it that way, it would be really great. I just want to say one thing, that last week, I'm very proud to say that San Francisco State University student government voted for divestment from Israel. And it was amazing effort led by the Palestinian students, General Union of Palestine students, all their allies, all the student groups. A historical movement came together, and it was a vote. And now, of course, we're going to see the Zionists fighting against it. We will see the administration fighting against it. But this is a huge accomplishment, especially at the time when we are very much attacked and so on. So it can happen. It just really takes long-term protracted struggle. And it also takes for us to shift the way we present things and the way we speak about things, and really build real alliances, not alliances of transaction.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sam.
The issue of representation of Palestinians have been an issue from the early on, the struggle. Palestinians were under British mandate, never had the opportunity to actually elect their own representatives. So the representation always came through the struggle. Those who were leading the struggle would usually lead the Palestinian voice of the Palestinian people. When the PLO was founded back in 1964, it was founded by the Arab regimes, through the Arab League, to represent the voice of the Palestinians. It was in a sense that the Arabs wanted to unload the burden of Palestine on the Palestinians, but they chose who would represent the Palestinians. After the 1967 defeat, the Palestinian factions who started struggling with Israel directly, particularly Fatah and the PLFP and so on and so forth, they rose to the leadership of the PLO. And since Fatah was the largest faction, they became de facto leaders of the PLO. And then they led the struggle to make the PLO the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That went until about 1993 into the Oslo Accords, where the Israelis found their magic solution to this problem by creating the Palestinian Authority and putting the PLO on the side. and empowering Fatah and those who claim to represent the Palestinian people to be in charge of the Palestinian Authority. So it is a problem, it's a challenge that the Palestinians have been facing, and they haven't been able to actually resolve. All the talk about PLO being the representative of the Palestinian people is an empty talk, because the PLO has not been functional. As I said, earlier in my remarks, that it's been on life support. There is no real PLO going on. There is no real mechanism for electing the people to represent the so-called Palestinian National Council, that met for the past, since Oslo, twice. One of them to actually renounce their own charter in front of an American president in Gaza. So it's a problem. But as I said, the real representation are the people who are on the forefront of the struggle. These are the real representatives. To think that Palestinians are free and they have the right to self-determination where they can actually meet and have free and fair elections is a myth, is a mirage. It's not going to happen. Not because Israel doesn't want to happen, it's because the whole situation doesn't make it happen. Now, in some communities around the world, the Palestinians could actually organize themselves and have representatives. And I would encourage that to take place, if possible. But if it doesn't, we still have those who are at the forefront of the struggle for liberation, for freedom, for the right of return, for self-determination, for dignity. These are the real representatives. And those, even though they are recognized by the whole world to represent the Palestinian people, but they are willing to sacrifice all Palestinian rights, they cannot be legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. Any person who recognizes Israel on any part of Palestine is a Zionist. And Zionist here is not a curse. I mean, it's a description. It's not a bad word. I mean, if anybody believes that Israel has the right to establish a state or an entity on any part of Palestine, is a Zionist. It is just a description, and people sometimes get mad because they are described as being Zionist. It's just a description. If that's what they believe, that's who they are. So everybody who believes in a two-state solution is partially a Zionist. And what I'm saying here, as long as Zionism exists in Palestine, there will never be peace. There will never be reconciliation. There will never be stability. And I take exception, it's not the Palestinians who feel exception. It's the nature of the struggle. It is the existence of Israel. Israel, as it exists today, is anathema to the whole region. This region cannot have peace with the presence of Israel, cannot have unity with the presence of Israel. If you find any problem or any struggle here, Israel has a hand in it. If there is a division in Sudan, it's because Israel wanted Sudan to be divided and did everything in its power to happen. If you're going to split Turkey and you want a Kurdish state, you will find Israel is behind it. If you want Iraq to split into three, you will find Israel is working day and night to make this a reality. If you want any country that wants to advance technologically, Israel will make sure it doesn't happen because it sees them as a threat to its survival and its existence. So as long as Israel is there, it wants to be the hegemon over the whole region. And for it, that means everyone else has to take a back seat, have to accept that Israel is the regional hegemon. And they are representatives of all the colonialist powers, and they work on their behalf to make sure that their interests are being served in the whole region. And if the people of the area resist this, that means they have to resist the existence and the presence of Israel. And that's the real nature. And that's why the Palestinian struggle becomes a central issue for everybody, not because Palestinians suffer more than others. We certainly suffer less. For instance, the Syrians that they had suffered in the past 10 years, or the Afghans or the Yemenis. But it is the central issue of the whole region is because of this fact, is because Israel wants to become the hegemon, and they want everyone else to become their subservients, their clients. And if people resist this, then they have to see that this is not going to end until that is either a reality. Either Israel becomes the hegemon, or Israel as a Zionist entity is no more. So the issue of representation, to me, is tied to this: who is struggling against this the Zionist nature of the state. But more importantly, also, when we talk about what part of the Palestinian people are actually struggling, I say, as I said earlier, this is not a struggle just for the Palestinians against Israel. This is a struggle for all peace loving. And I'm you know, when I talk about genuine peace, those who are seek freedom and seek a discourse where justice is the highest value, not who is more powerful to impose their will on the others.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. I think because we started 5 minutes late, so I have a lot of questions, but
actually we started 10 minutes late, so you can extend by 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. So I can stay a little bit more. I have some question here for everyone. I will read some of them, and please pick one of them and try to answer it within 1 minute, at least 1 minute or 1.5 minutes. So then we can finish on the time. My first question is how the Arab-Israeli normalization will affect the Palestinian as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My second question is what is the future of the deal of century? Is it finished, or maybe it will come back, or Biden will continue with this? Also, I would like to hear what do you think about the future of the settlement in West Bank? Are we going to witness the same kind of continuation of the settlement in Palestine or not? Also, we have one question about like a kind of practical advice that will make Biden listen to the Palestinian and to affect, let's say, them positively, the discourse. And also the last question, could be for Dr. Sami. You mentioned dismantling Zionism movement. What are the steps for this? Please try to keep 1.5 minutes, then we can finish on the time.
But you need if you need to distribute the questions, because someone may try to answer all of them. If you want to just say, give one.
No, just pick one of them, please, and answer. So that's it.
All right. Perhaps Miko can address the settlement one.
Okay. Go ahead, Miko, please.
Well, I think all of us certainly agree that there is no such thing as a legal settlement anywhere in Palestine. I don't think that necessarily the settlements, the colonies that were built in the West Bank are really any different than the settlements that were built in other parts of Palestine. All of them are built on stolen Palestinian land, benefit from stolen Palestinian resources, which are of course land, water, and in the cases of colonies that were built after 1948, there was fruit on the trees, there was produce in the fields, there was incredible amounts of wealth, like Palestinians say, "Khaduha mafrusha." Palestine was taken, furnished, fully furnished and very rich. So I don't think there's really a difference between those the settlements on one part of Palestine and settlements in the other part of Palestine. I think the bigger question here, again, goes back to, and if we go back to BDS, how we deal with the larger question, like Dr. Sami was saying, dismantling the Zionist entity, dismantling, decolonizing Palestine. And when the refugees are allowed to return, and not only the refugees, but some of the refugees are internal refugees, some of the refugees still live in Palestine, except they can't live on their own land. There has to be a mechanism to make sure that they receive reparations and compensation. There's going to have to be, when we talk about one person, one vote, when we talk about the first step in creating a post-Zionist Palestine. What I envision is, as a result of BDS, as a result of pressure and so forth, that an Israeli prime minister like de Klerk steps up and says, well, we are releasing the political prisoners. We are allowing for all political parties to run equally, and we are calling for a one person, one vote election everywhere, anyone who lives from the River Jordan to the sea. And that's really the first step in the collapse of the apartheid regime. I think in South Africa, that was a big step. That was the step. what happens next? That is not the end of the Palestinian question. That does not solve the problems. That is the first step. The next step is a legislature that represents the people for the first time. There's never been a legislature in Palestine that represents all the people. Then an executive that represents the people. And then we start dealing with all of these issues. You know, people talk about a flag, people talk about the settlements, people talk about reparations, people talk about the mechanism by which the refugees are able to return. These are not complicated to the point where they're not possible to resolve. They're all resolvable. But these are issues that will require some planning, that will require some experts sitting together and putting together, a mechanism to do all this. And I think the settlements and the stealth of Palestinian land and the building of Jewish-only settlements on all of Palestine, really, and again, there's no difference, I think, between the West Bank and other parts of Palestine, will be a serious one. How is this resolved? You know, how do you deal with the fact that people are living there? How do you deal with the fact that the people who the land belongs to, in many cases, the homes belong to, and so forth, are coming back, and they need to be compensated, and there needs to be a resolution of this issue. So again, it's one of these important issues that can only be dealt with once Palestine is free, and once there's a real representation of all Palestinians and all of the needs and all of the interests of Palestinians, which, again, like Dr. Sami says, that does not exist and has not existed in a very long time, if ever. An entity that represents all the Palestinians and has the capacity and the power to actually resolve these issues, discuss them in a serious way, and then bring the resolution to these issues.
Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Ramzi.
Thank you, Fadi. I'm going to try to be brief. Just a couple of points. First of all, I think that the deal of the century was a great success. Just remind ourselves, the term deal of the century itself was kind of haphazardly invented. It wasn't something that really they spent years trying to manufacture something. The idea was the Trump administration, under the Jared Kushner sponsorship, we're going to give Israel everything it wants. And that's exactly what they did. The term, the deal of the century itself, was just created on the spot by Trump when he was talking about, I have a deal, this is going to be the great deal, it's the best deal. And then eventually the etymology of it developed to the deal of the century, and we all used it as if it was a pre-plan. It wasn't. It was basically giving Israel a blank check to do exactly what it wants. And that's precisely what has happened in the last 4 years. And it continues to happen until now. And I think we should expect some really bad news in the next few weeks regarding this. Two very quick things I'd like to say about the deal of the century. Almost every aspect of it has its roots in previous American governments. The transfer of the Jerusalem embassy, for example, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that has already been agreed upon by the Congress in the mid-90s and has already been kind of really given the nod and the approval by various governments, W. Bush and others and everybody until today. What Trump has done is he has taken US diplomacy, US foreign policy just a step closer. Normalization has always been part of the deal of the century. Let's overcome the whole Palestinian obstacle. Let's not even acknowledge Palestinians at all, as if this is the 50s and the 60s all over again. The Palestinian leadership doesn't matter, doesn't count. So let's make that leap and talk to Arabs, normalize with the Arabs, regardless of what Palestinians want and don't want. So really, that's what it was. And it was a great success in that sense. And the sad reality is Biden is going to carry on with much of what that deal of the century has achieved to Israel. He's not going to reverse the settlement move, but they will pay few political platitudes. They will take few symbolic steps. They will establish they will reopen the American embassy or consulate rather in East Jerusalem to engage the Palestinians and so forth. But as far as the deal of the century is concerned, that is a done deal. And I think very little of it, if any, will be reversed anytime soon. Very quick, I promise. I just want to say that we haven't spoken about this enough in this webinar. and that is resistance. Really, I think the solution is not about representation. What national liberation movement in the world, and please, I am actually asking if anyone has the answer, that actually ran democratic elections under colonialism? It's unheard of. We need a strong leadership, but we don't necessarily should expect Israel to allow us to go and vote and stand in lines in Ramallah and Hebron, and the settlers are going to sit and watch us as we carry on with our democratic duties. Is not going to happen. We need a better leadership than this, leadership of self-seeking, corrupt men in Ramallah. That's what we need. A leadership that uses the concept of resistance as the part and parcel of any Palestinian strategy to finally liberate Palestine. I'm done.
Much very clear points, very important. Dr. Rabab.
Yeah, I think the questions there are several questions that have already been answered by my colleagues, and I think Dr. Sami wants to take on the question of dismantling Zionism because this is what he's been working on. So I don't have anything to say about advice for Biden because first of all he's not going to listen to me, but I also don't think it doesn't work. It's not about giving him advice or something. It's really about how we struggle together. And I think I just wanted to speak about something else. I'm going to make it very brief. Is how are we going to make this happen? How are we going to achieve what we are? I have for a very long time believed. I don't really necessarily subscribe to one state, two state, three state, 100 states. Definitely not two states. I don't agree. But I don't think one state is sufficient. I think that we really need to have a different kind of a movement. I think we need a Palestinian movement that actually has a very clear program of inclusion that is somewhat like the African National Congress plan, but actually more than that, because the African National Congress was talking about one person, one vote. But I think one person, one vote is not enough, because even if you have one person, one vote, you're going to end up with what happened after 1994 in South Africa. Political apartheid in terms of discrimination on the books was removed, but so was segregation in the United States in 1965. And look where we're still today. So it's not about that. It's about complete, I agree, complete decolonization. And complete decolonization really requires a different kind of movement, not by only who are Palestinian Arabs, mostly Muslims and Jews coming together, but it really requires having everybody who is of those lands and of their lands, of the diasporas of those lands, to come together to create a different kind of project, completely different kind of project that also includes liberation, that also includes freedom, that does not only speak about kind of like economic liberal project and so on, but it actually really rethinks, remaps, revamps all our social, political, economic relations with each other. Now, some people may say, oh, this is unrealistic. Yeah, okay. I mean, now it's unrealistic. But people have never, ever started a movement. And what Dr. Sami will speak about, I'm not going to talk about that. But you never, ever start a movement because you actually think you're going to win tomorrow. Movements are not a deal. Movements are not something I'm going to do something today in order for me to get rewarded tomorrow. Movements are a belief in something that we believe in, the cause of freedom. We believe in the cause of justice. We believe in this. And we are going to stay in it for the long, protracted struggle, because it may not happen for me tomorrow. It may not happen for my children. It may happen sometime. But I think we really need to kind of rethink about that. So in that sense, I do agree with Dr. Sami about the whole question of representation. And I have a lot of criticism of the PLO and so on. I don't know if we say eye to eye about every single way of the struggle, but I do agree with the general idea. I agree with the whole question with that BDS is a very important and powerful tool. And I agree about the whole, uselessness of actually thinking about elections in a particular way. I do think, however, that these are issues that we can actually organize, mobilize around, critique. But the major issue becomes about how do we create a movement in order for us to take us into another thing, not like what we had in 1948, because what we had in 1948, I say as Palestinians, we do have a lot of inequalities. We do have a lot of issues. We were colonized. I mean, we were under colonialism. That's why it was British colonialism. That's why Israel was possible. I think we need to think about a different vision and really dare imagine the impossible, which does not have to be the impossible on the day of liberation.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Sami, you have 1 minute.
Wow.
1.5 minutes.
Well, first I want to thank all my colleagues for their great contribution in this webinar. This has really been great. The issue of dismantling Zionism, as I said, has to come through a worldwide solidarity movement that goes beyond just the Palestinians. I have identified, as I said earlier, 12 different imperatives or sources of strength. We need to see each one and see how we can perhaps even mobilize the people around it. For example, the first one or the first two is about exclusion and exclusivism. The Zionists want an exclusive state for the Jews, and they want to exclude the Palestinians. So one response would be to make sure that the Palestinians would stay in the land, and that they would be steadfast, and that this imperative will not be successful. Also, that they are not, they haven't succeeded actually. I mean, there's only 6.5 million Jews out of maybe 16 million around the world. So they haven't been able to transfer all the Jews into Palestine. Another one has to do that they depend on a major state, a great power for their survival. And they went through different states. Now they settled on the United States. So there has to be a real movement within the United States to weaken this Zionist grip on the elites, on those who make decisions, on those who are in power, to make this, this relationship between the United States and Israel, so that it gives Israel all the cover it needs politically, diplomatically, economically, militarily, and so on and so forth. So that means it's an imperative then that we must have this movement within the United States, because if we can break that lifeline, certainly the Zionist states would be on its heels. So, I mean, the point here is that dismantling Zionism is not something that happens overnight. As apartheid, I mean, I remember the struggle in apartheid. This is a struggle that went into decades. I remember the 80s, that's when we were part of it. And I could see the end of apartheid and how things were starting to break down very quickly at the end. The United States was the last country to leave apartheid South Africa and to let it go. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. So establishing this, not just as a Palestinian movement, Palestinians could be at the heart of it, they could even spearhead it, but it cannot be a Palestinian movement. It's a worldwide movement, because this is a movement for justice. Everyone has a stake in this. And part of this movement is going to ally itself with all justice-seeking movements around the world. And this is not a movement against Jews. I want to emphasize that very, very much. This is against Zionism. There is no, I do not equate, I will never and should never equate Zionism with Judaism. Actually, when Zionism is dismantled, we save Judaism as a great religion. And we when the Jews left Spain, they because of the persecution they had to endure when the Islamic State fell down, the only countries they found refuge, otherwise they would have either killed or converted. It would have been simply to go and reside in any part of the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia. The same thing will happen here, but it's not at the expense. I mean, if Europe has anti-Semitism and the West generally, and they cannot have the Jews there, we're willing to have them anywhere, but not at the expense of Palestinians, and certainly not with the existence of a racist state. Again, I want to thank everybody for being here today. And I hope that we can come together in the future as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the participants, and thank you for participating in our web. I especially want to thank Fadi for being a guest host on the webinars. As someone who is a ardent sympathizer, supporter, brethren for the cause of Palestine, it's always a pleasure to hear our intellectual leaders speak and enlighten us on the way forward. One of the thoughts that came to my mind over the course of hearing your conversation was that maybe it's time to consider that decolonization was a failure. And we have this idea that, you know, if we just decolonize Palestine, that we would have some kind of bright future. But sitting in 2020, when we see states like Iraq and states like Yemen and Libya and many other neighbors in the region being dismantled and destroyed over and over again, I wonder whether it's time to consider that the very idea of decolonization as it was presented was itself a failure. Thank you for all the participants, and hopefully, and to those who are listening, please stay tuned for our next webinar in the coming